Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session on critical race perspectives on the use of research evidence. Our team here at the William T. Grant Foundation are just so excited about this session. It couldn't be more important conversation to be having at this moment in time. This panel extends from the Foundation's initiative on studying the use of research evidence in policy and practice. It's an initiative that we started in 2009, so just over a decade ago, when we, along with others, were struggling with how to make research more useful and used in policy and practice. As a research funder, we thought we'd done a wonderful job. We supported a lot of good research and a lot of terrific researchers. But collectively, we were frustrated that often the research wasn't seen as useful enough to influence policy and practice, and that it was often not getting used. And so we really wanted to work on this problem. And as a research funder, we thought, well, this is a problem that we could study. We could build some stronger theory and empirical evidence to guide our efforts to support more useful and used research. And since then, we've funded over $25 million in over 60 studies of this topic. And over the last decade, grantees have produced a lot of important findings, made important contributions to the field. They've challenged some predominant notions about what it takes for research to be useful or what it takes for research to be used. They've really debunked a lot of these common beliefs that a one-way communication strategy or a one-way push-out dissemination strategy is enough to get research used. But at the same time, while we and our grantees have challenged some predominant beliefs, we have not challenged others. And what we have done is we've been largely silent about the role of race and racism in the use of research evidence. I wrote last year in a blog post that research is not colorblind. We knew that research is not colorblind. And yet our initiative failed to account for the ways in which race and racism matter for what research is produced, which research gets used, and who benefits from the ways in which research is deployed. We too often assumed that using research is a good thing, or using rigorous research is a good thing, but we fail to consider that use of research is not neutral in a society that is not neutral. So about a year and a half ago, our then senior program officer, Kim Dumont, organized a panel at our annual convening on this topic. And the panel examined how race and racism mattered for the production and use of research evidence. And then we followed up that panel with two terrific publications, which I highly recommend. Both of them are available on the WHOVA site as well as on the William T. Grant Foundation site. The first one was by David Kirkland. It's called No Small Matters, Reimagining the Use of Research Evidence from a Racial Justice Perspective. And the second is by our own Fabienne Doucet, who wrote Centering the Margins, Redefining Useful Research Evidence through Critical Perspectives. I highly recommend both of these readings. And so this current panel is now in a continuation of this effort where we're trying to push ourselves, push our applicants and our grantees, and push the broader field so that we're collectively centering race more productively and really understanding the role that race and racism plays in the production and use of research evidence. Our hope is that a critical race lens will help us envision ways of bringing research to bear on policies, practices, and social movements to disrupt racial hierarchies. Now, if research has been used as a tool in the past for oppression, if it's been used as a tool of oppression, it stands to reason that it could also be leveraged as a tool of liberation. And we're searching for the ways to make that happen. And we're asking ourselves what it would take to foster widespread uses of research to dismantle the pernicious structures that create racial inequality for young people. I could not be more pleased to have three wonderful panelists joining us today to share their insights and their wisdom on these topics. The first is Jamila Michener. She is the Associate Professor of Government at Cornell University and the co-director of Cornell Center for Health Equity. She will be speaking first. Next, we have Janelle Scott. She is Professor of Education and the Robert C. and Mary Catherine Birgeneau Distinguished Chair in Educational Disparities at UC Berkeley. And third, we have Fabienne Doucet, our very own Program Officer at the William T. Grant Foundation. We are very fortunate that Fabienne is working with us while she's on leave from New York University as an associate professor. We've asked these three panelists to address three questions. First, we wanted them to help anchor us in critical perspectives and just tell us how they define critical race perspectives or other critical perspectives, and what it is about those perspectives that they're bringing to bear on understanding the use of research evidence. Some of you may be like me, maybe you've read a few articles using critical race theory, a few articles on critical policy analysis. So you have a bit of a background, but not an in-depth understanding of the nuances of these theories and these different perspectives. So I asked them to start by just grounding us in these perspectives, in these lenses. Next, I've asked them to tell us what improved use of research evidence would look like if we embrace these critical race perspectives. What would be considered good uses of research evidence if we embrace these perspectives? And then third, I asked them, what do we need to better understand, or what do we need to study in order to bring about those uses of research evidence? So they're going to present on these three questions in somewhat different ways, but I'm looking forward to hearing them share their insights on them. So with that, I will turn it over to Jamila Michener to start us off.
Thank you, Vivian, for that wonderful introduction. I'm happy to be here today, having this important conversation with all of you. I'm just going to share my screen so that you all can see my slides. And then let me just switch that over. Okay, so, we're talking, I'm a political scientist, I should say, so I might have a perspective that's slightly different in the sense that I'm often thinking about things like power and democracy. And so when I think about use of research evidence and studying the use of research evidence, right, understanding patterns and sort of systematically having an understanding of how the use of research evidence works and how it operates, I'm often thinking about those questions in the larger context of trying to understand the consequences for democracy. And that, I think, very much brings us into the orbit of thinking about the kinds of questions that we're pushed to think about when we have a kind of critical race lens that we bring to these conversations, right? And so in particular, one of the most critical and central interventions that emerges from bringing a kind of critical perspective that's oriented around and centered around race and racism, bringing that perspective to questions to really any questions, right? And a central intervention that critical scholars of race have made is the observation, which perhaps seems now obvious to us, but is an observation that has to consistently be made and remade, that racism permeates all of our institutions, right? So whether we think about some of the foundational bedrock institutional structures in the United States, like our Constitution, when we think about courts, criminal and civil legal institutions, when we think about Congress, right, and the operation of political institutions at the federal and then at state and local levels. And of course, when we think about public policy, challenges around and the fundamental sort of issues of race and racism permeate all of these institutions. And in fact, these institutions are built on practices of racism and white supremacy. And so what does that mean for us? Part of what it means, and I think quite importantly, is that we don't stand outside those institutional realities. Those of us who are engaged in research, in academic research and scholarship, whether from within academia or from various vantage points outside of academia, we are not exempt from the realities of key institutional pillars in the United States and beyond being built on the bedrock of racism and white supremacy. And scholars that bring a kind of critical lens to studying race and to studying, whatever we may be studying from a vantage point of a kind of recognition of and understanding of the role of racism, note that even in the institutions that we're inhabiting, these realities remain. So if we think about, for example, academic institutions, this hashtag Black in the Ivory is a perfect example. And if you go to Twitter and you put that hashtag in, you'll see many, many examples of Black scholars sharing about their experiences in the sort of academic realm as researchers, as scholars, and sharing about the ways that experiences of racism sort of permeate the roles that they play in those institutions. There was something almost cathartic for me about reading through these hashtags because of how much it resonated, but there was also something startling to sort of bring to the fore so many practices that in many ways I've just come to adapt to and cope with, right? But importantly, what that tells us is that as we think about racism and we're imagining and thinking about creative ways, both of using research and of studying the use of research evidence, we need to be attuned to the lessons that critical approaches to scholarship teach us, right? And part of what that means is rethinking the use of research evidence with an eye towards the insights of critical race scholars. And as I view it, critical uses of research evidence do this. They deploy research that's rooted in the perspectives and experiences of people of color. And they do this, they deploy that research for purposes that intentionally connect to and benefit communities of color. One of the values of having this criteria for identifying critical uses of research evidence is that we can't study critical uses of research evidence until we know what to look for, until we identify those uses. And this is one way of identifying what that looks like. And I'm going to specify some examples here of both of these points of what it means to deploy research rooted in the perspectives and experiences of people of color, and what it means to do so for purposes that intentionally connect to and benefit those communities. And once we can identify those examples and instances of what critical uses of research evidence look like, we'll be better equipped to study those critical uses of research evidence and to understand more systematically their implications, right? So one of the kind of phrases that I often use when I'm talking about this topic, and in particular as we think about critical uses of research evidence, is this idea of nothing about us without us is for us. So that if you're doing research that's about a particular population, and you're imagining that this research is for that population, that somehow it's going to help them, but it doesn't include them in some fundamental way or center them in some fundamental way, then it is not indeed for them, right? Nothing about us without us is for us. And this is, of course, a phrase that I get from organizers that I've engaged with, and one that's used regularly in organizing communities, but that we can gain our own insights from taking seriously as scholars. So critical uses of research evidence do two things. One is they deploy capacity, or they develop rather, capacity in and for racially marginalized communities. And the other is that they build power in and for racially marginalized communities. So This is about what the uses of research evidence do, what they achieve, right? And so I want to talk about what both of those things look like in some more detail. What might it mean for research evidence to be used for capacity development in racially marginalized communities, right? We can think about this with respect to developing research questions in consultation with or in response to policy priorities that are dictated by community members. In other words, what is shaping and dictating the nature of the questions you're asking, the nature of your research agenda? And if in fact, your research is for particular communities, then it should be shaped by and in response to the prerogatives and the priorities expressed by members of those communities, right? One example I give is around some work that I'm doing now that's focused on housing challenges. And I've been engaging in a lot of qualitative research with renters and with people who are being evicted. And I have encountered questions that have stemmed from my kind of contact and engagement with these folks that have really upended my research agenda. And so there are things I hadn't thought about before that only occurred to me once I started talking to people who were actually in these communities who were facing eviction. One quick example is I'm working on a paper now that's about state preemption of local policies. So when a city like Atlanta says, we want to try to have rent control, and then the state legislature in Georgia says, no, we're going to pass a law that says no city in the state can have rent control, as a way of preempting what Atlanta is doing. I hadn't thought about that topic at all before I started talking to organizers on the ground who were community members who said, we need rent control, and we can't get rent control until we deal with preemption. So that's what we want to focus on. I would have thought that preemption was this far away abstract idea, far away from the community, perhaps not relevant. And instead, community members told me, no, this is a priority for us. We want to understand how to make this happen. That's what we want your research evidence to teach us, right? And then, of course, there's rather basic researchers presenting their ideas, their research designs, their findings to lay audiences, to the people who we imagine research is for, but who we often take for granted don't have any potential influence. And so we don't present our ideas to them and our research to them. We focus instead on quote unquote elites. And what I found in my experience, and this is a picture from a time when I did this in a community in St. Petersburg, Florida, presented research ideas to lay folks who had come just to talk about and learn about race and public policy. And it was extremely fruitful. It changed the way that I thought about my research, but there were also some policymakers, some community organizers, and some ordinary people there that got ideas about how they were gonna approach community organizing and change in their local community. And then of course, there's conducting research with and for local community organizations. And so that's really a kind of co-production of research with members of the community. So then the second point is just research evidence for power building. And power is not something that we always think about in relation to the use of research evidence, but I would say it's a direction to go in, both in terms of using research and studying the use of research evidence and understanding how power matters as we study the use of research evidence. And this involves considering the research process itself as an opportunity to build power. How might the research process itself lead to power being built in communities? That's a question we can ask about the research process and its role in shaping democracy, really. So there's an organization that I did some work with in New York City called CASA, Community Action for Safe Apartments. And they told me about how community members, as a part of a campaign they had around fighting back against exploitative and damaging practices in their local housing court. And they had this campaign, they had community members go all throughout the community and essentially surveyed their fellow community members about their experience in housing court. And what they really emphasized to me, something that they hadn't expected until it happened, that the process of surveying 1,000 community members in the neighborhoods they were dealing with, who were surveyed by their fellow community members, that very process built a kind of power in the community. They had more people coming to their organizations, coming to their meetings, wanting to be involved in their organizing and in their mobilizing. And it was the research process itself, it was collecting the evidence that led to that result. And then, of course, considering the ways that research evidence can be used to fuel demands for change. So one example here is an organization called Food and Water Watch. And what they do is they track water shutoffs throughout the country. This is something that federal and state and local agencies don't do. We have no idea how many people across this country are getting their water shut off, but we know that it's consistent enough that it affects many people, especially people living in poverty. And Food and Water Watch started tracking this. And what they found is just by tracking this, by presenting and providing this evidence, that communities started to respond. They started to see how common water shutoffs were and to understand and formulate water shutoff as a political problem and to present that problem to political elites and other people with hands on the levers of change. And they were more equipped to do this once the research evidence provided them with the fuel for the fire of their demands for change, right? So all of this is to say that as we think about research evidence, we should also think about how research evidence can be used to build power and to create an equitable democracy. And then, of course, we should study the instances in which research evidence is being used to do that, to truly understand the scope and the possibilities embedded in using research evidence for the public good. So I'll stop there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jamila. That was always so wonderful to hear from you. I am also going to share my screen. Vivian, I can see you. Can you give me a thumbs up if that's looking good? Awesome. Okay, I'm going to start my timer as Vivian asked us to. And as I'm doing that, I just want to say how pleased I am to be here with you all from smoky California. Just think of us and our terrible air quality as you go about the rest of your week. And just lovely to see so many old friends on the attendee list and people I don't know but I admire, and new friends that I hope one day when we can all come together, I'll meet in person. So I'm going to talk specifically about critical policy analysis and the use of research evidence and how critical policy analysis might actually improve URE work and the actual use of research evidence. To do that, I just want to say I love research and I love researchers. I love you all, and I'm going to talk about you now. So just if you feel criticized, if you feel triggered, just take some deep restorative breaths and just go with me, and know that it comes from a deep place of love and belief in the value of the work that that we do for society, for institutions, for children and families. So let's see here. So one of the things I want to argue is that we, the research community, has actually been complicit, right, in limiting what counts as rigor and reliability in knowledge production, in the service of wanting our work to matter, to be used by policymakers and practitioners to inform the public. I think we've really narrowed what counts as knowledge, what counts as reliability, what counts as rigor, and the language then of what works, particularly in education policy, has been reduced to what we can measure by standardized test scores, usually in just a couple of subjects, or some other sort of outcome metrics that are standardized. And that's really, I think, come to dominate what we think about in terms of research on effectiveness in schooling. But this research often draws from positivist approaches that are atheoretical and disconnected from the histories, from the structures, and the experiences of minoritized and disadvantaged people. And then those who ascend, right, as leaders in our fields become gatekeepers. So here's this picture of the palace being gatekept. And other people who maybe have other ways of offering ways of knowing are shut out, and grants and all sorts of financial support follows that. And so I think when we exclude these other sources of knowledge and potential contributions to research use by failing to engage in critical theories, then we become complicit in what we don't know. And some of what we saw over the summer in the US and across the world were really people speaking out about long-term historical, hundreds of years suffering with regards to race and racism. And so I think what I would like to argue then even further is that we have to let go of some of what we've called the gold standard, right, in educational research. And this ideal that any one discipline or any one method holds a singular power to speak to complex issues, right? And so CPA, critical policy analysis, and other critical perspectives might displace some other perspectives, but I think this displacement is going to ultimately enrich our understanding of these perplexing questions, these persistent inequalities, particularly in schooling, that we otherwise have not been able to permeate at scale. So I draw here from insight from Ezekiel Dixon-Roman, who is a critical quantitative scholar, right? And so I just wanted to surface his insight, but also to say that this is not an attack on methods, right? The methods wars have been fought and really yielded nothing of value except hurt feelings, right? So you can deploy critical policy analysis or critical race theories or other critical theories and still engage in quantitative work. But Dixon-Roman asked us to think about the dominant orientation toward quantitative social science research that neglects critical theories and assumes this privilege access to the truths of natural phenomena through a logic of mathematics, and that from his perspective has limited our understandings. I just want to offer a very recent example from a thinker and scholar and public intellectual who I admire, right? Paul Krugman got himself into a little bit of trouble on Twitter recently around 9/11. And I just think it's a really great example of how policy claims can rest on problematic assumptions about data, even when methods are sound. So this is not questioning whether, a methodological approach or analysis is unsound. And so Professor Krugman wanted to make a claim that after 9/11, we didn't see a rise in hate crimes against Muslims in the United States. And right, and so he's using that claim to make a claim and critique about President Trump. And immediately there was a backlash on Twitter where people were saying, you're wrong, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And then he came back a couple days later and said, no, let me explain how I'm right? If you look at the FBI hate crime database, you can see we didn't see it. Well, he's saying he's making a claim, but his data are incomplete because he didn't necessarily base his claim on the unique lived experiences of Muslims, right, in the United States and the ways that hate crimes can happen that don't show up in official government data. So in a book I recently published with Sonia Douglas-Horford and Gary Anderson, we tried to advance what critical policy analysis might look like if we applied it to education policy specifically. And so in our imagination, critical policy analysis emanates from insights from critical race theory, with the idea that race is central to, as Jamila argued, to institutions and organizations. But we also draw from feminist theories and feminist ways of knowing to focus on politics, history, governance, and economics. We look at policy as discourse and political spectacle. As Jamila said, we center perspectives of the minoritized, marginalized, and oppressed. We hold power at the center as well. And there's an effort to hold those in power accountable. And we think that critical policy analysis is important in conjunction with other ways of knowing, right? It's not a total erasure of other ways of knowing, it's additive. Because there are big questions that some of the more narrow analyses that are under-theorized simply can't answer alone. And so they're questions that I just want to raise. Is this policy good for the health and well-being of children, right? Does it allow them to reach their potential as learners, citizens, and humans? Is this policy or practice good for developing and sustaining robust systems that serve and support communities? how does this policy address and acknowledge and disrupt racism and the specificities of Indigenous and anti-Black racism? How does this intervention relate to the history of racism, of dispossession and accumulation of power with regard to minoritized children and communities? What power needs to be shared or redistributed? So these are questions that critical policy analysis can help to inform, right, in conjunction with other work. And I want to stress that, that we need multimodal, multi-method work to address these big questions. I want to draw as an example from my work with Elizabeth Debray, who's here somewhere on this remote call, and Christopher Lewisinsky, our William T. Grant funded work on the politics of research use. And our work in New Orleans in post-Hurricane Katrina context in which the entire system was charterized, very controversial, has been used as a model, depending on how well you think it's worked, as a model to scale up or as a model to run away from. And what we found very early on that this graphic displays is that we had these very identifiable coalitions in which information and evidence was being shared. But these coalitions were disparate and they were using different data, right? They had different access to data, in part, if you see where the Cowan Institute is at the center, because the state was only giving data to selected groups, right, who were more aligned with the state agenda for New Orleans. But these other groups, I guess it's on the left, bottom left of your screen, which were oppositional groups, civil rights groups, were collecting on the ground data about how communities were experiencing the tumult and the churn that was happening in the city. And these narratives were completely missing each other. And I think for the most part, folks would say in New Orleans, those narratives continue to miss each other. And so I think our critical policy analysis can help to bring some of these narratives together and think about what that means for truth and understanding how we produce our knowledge and understanding about what counts as true. Because for many people in the upper right coalition, they would say these reforms are working. Another, I just want to, in a parallel way to Jamila, who brought up the Black in the Ivory, you know, we saw a similar speaking out over the summer for Black teachers and students who were in some of the very charter schools that are being scaled up in New York and New Orleans. These schools have been championed by researchers as successful, largely because of test scores and graduation rates. And as a result, many researchers have recommended the scaling up of these networks across the country. And what we saw over the summer is actual students starting to speak out about what their experiences have been in those schools and some of the traumas that they have experienced within those schools, and teachers experiencing trauma of feeling like they had to mete out very harsh discipline to Black children and to brown children. And the point here is not to beat up on charters or even these networks, but to think about what they tell us about the possibilities and limits of knowledge production. How do we decide something's working if we are excluding the very experiences that might tell us from the perspective of those experiencing these interventions? And so I think this is going to require us to let go of some of our disciplinary commitments, right? So there have been reckonings across disciplines this summer, but even as early as 2011, there was a report from the American Political Science Association that called that discipline to really think through how it's theorizing things like power or even democracy. And so drawing from Strickland, who says, you know, how can we profess as a discipline to say that we study democracy if we're not acknowledging what this democracy is based on, right? Things like slavery, the denial of civic participation, the exclusion of population groups, the accrual of wealth at the top. And he argues that ignoring these things when we theorize a particular construct is tantamount to studying medicine without dissecting cadavers, right? It's studying chemistry without a lab, or biology by only looking at a particular kind of living thing, in this case, wax plants. So just to conclude, where does that leave us? Critical policy analysis can help us to think about how our research across focus, across mode, can be mutually informative, right? To better address complex social issues. it can help us think critically about the power of analytic generation rather than generalization to populations. It can help to redirect strategies that seek to diversify disciplines, academic disciplines, but to not diversify the epistemologies, or the methods, or the theories within those disciplines that might actually encourage a broader population to pursue study within them. It helps us to identify the voices and perspectives and experiences that are missing from our research before making research use recommendations to policymakers or decision makers. And I never miss an opportunity to tell a foundation how to spend its money. So I would just say that I think foundations really have an opportunity to invest deeply and broadly in critical policy analysis or critical race theory informed studies, and to help with the translation of those studies for policymakers and communities and practitioners. I think this is just a space that has been deeply underinvested, and as a result, we do have variability in quality, which means we really need to think critically about building a field in the same way that we have built other fields and other methodological approaches. So I will stop there. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Janelle. Another provocative presentation. We're going to move very quickly into our third presentation. And so I'm going to turn it over to Fabienne Doucet.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jamila and Janelle, for your wonderful talks. I'm really just so honored to be here with you. So I'm going to get my talk going here. Okay. Just one second, sorry. Here I go. Okay, so this talk today sort of builds on the essay that Vivian mentioned at the beginning that I wrote last winter for the Winter Digest. And there I focused a lot on the usefulness of research and how, who determines what research is useful when we use critical race theory and critical perspectives to understand them. So this is an offshoot of that. And I'll also say that you'll hear many echoes to what Jamila and Janelle have already said as I go through. So just to provide just a little bit of framing in terms of what I mean when I talk about critical theory, if my slide would just advance. Okay. Just a second. There we go. Okay. So this is, just from that piece. I provide first just sort of like this umbrella definition of critical theories that they interrogate societal systems and structures. They pay attention to the production and reproduction of power hierarchies, social inequities, and the assumptions that we take for granted under ideological hegemonies that exist and that sort of undergird our society, like settler colonialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, imperialism. These are sort of these big ideologies that dominate. So critical theories are asking us to sort of upend those. And then for me, the particular critical theories that have informed my thinking about the use of research evidence are critical race theory. And here, I won't go into more of the explanation, as I think Jamila and Janelle have done a good job. I'll just say that using the words of Kimberly Crenshaw about what was meant by critical race theory when she and her colleagues started these workshops, it was critical, which means this is the political and intellectual location of their thinking, race, which is the substantive focus, and the theory, meaning a desire to develop a coherent account of race and the law. So that's really all it is, right? It's nothing more fancy than that. I also am really deeply informed by Black feminism. And this is, going back to roots as far back as Sojourner Truth, who declared, ain't I a woman, when she was addressing a group of women who were advocating for women's rights. And she was saying, I'm a woman too, but I'm also a Black woman. And this is also where we get the notion of intersectionality. And here, Kimberly Crenshaw literally used the image of a crosswalk of an intersection in a street to say, if a Black woman is harmed because she is in an intersection, her injury could result from sex discrimination or race discrimination, but it is not always easy to reconstruct an accident. Sometimes the skid marks and the injuries simply indicate that they occurred simultaneously, frustrating efforts to determine which driver caused the harm. So what do critical race perspectives tell us about research? Again, echoing ideas that have already been shared, research is inextricably linked and implicated in the societal structures and systems that have served to maintain power hierarchies. Research is conducted by humans, and so these are things that we can't really do anything about. And also, these systems accept social inequity as a given, and so we want to push against that. Applying critical lenses to research helps us to look under the hood of these fundamental assumptions. And you may be familiar with African saying popularized by Zimbabwean doctor and writer Jane Ozipho Morare, until the lion learns to write, tales of hunting will always glorify the hunter. And so it is with research. So until everyday people are able to write and tell their own stories, the stories that we as researchers tell about their lives will always glorify dominant discourses, stereotypes, caricatures, and incomplete stories. Critical lenses also disabuse us of notions that research is objective, colorblind, or neutral, and helps us to see that, how not questioning these assumptions and motivations that undergird these theories that frame our work, the people who conduct the research, the questions we ask, really lead very easily and very quickly to research that perpetuates deficit discourses about non-dominant groups that rely on what Gutierrez and Orellana call a predictable genre of difference that locates problems in marginalized people or disenfranchised communities rather than in systems and structures that maintain power hierarchies, and in what Eve Tuck has called damage-centered research. Right? So when we don't take critical views, these are the dangers that we face. So how can critical race perspectives help us reimagine research? In David Kirkland's essay for the Foundation's Winter Digest, he pointed out that the primary locus of inquiry in the study of research use, and I would add in research production, are questions of how. So like, what are our methods? What is the problem? And much less often questions of why. Why is this research being conducted, or why this finding? By whom, whose knowledge is being centered, and for whom, on whose behalf, and who benefits, as Vivian has noted, and Jamila and Janelle as well. So from a critical race perspective, I would offer that research can be reimagined, right, as being race and racism conscious, as strengths-based. Going back to Gutierrez and Orellana, most research starts with a problem of some kind, but there are different places to locate problems and many different kinds of problems that can be posed. We need to think carefully about the problems we name. Whose problem is it? For whom is it a problem? What other problems might we identify if we began from different vantage points? I also think that we can have research that is humanizing, that is for the purpose of humanizing research subjects. Research that is co-constructed rather than being researcher-led, and research that is people and community-centered. So centering the problems that people identify, as Jamila said, rather than those identified by researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and other powerful stakeholders. And here I'll also quote from David's essay from the Winter Digest: "We can no more afford methodologically rich research studies that lack racial consciousness than we can afford racially conscious studies that lack methodological rigor." So now I'm going to tell you about, shift a little bit into thinking about for the foundation, right? For our interests, we're trying to build this field and we really want to solicit proposals, and we know that this is emerging and these are new ideas. So here I'm going to just begin to share some thoughts about how we might begin to think about these things. But first, I'll start with just reminding us that what the evidence shows about improving evidence use. And so our grantee, Yitzhak Yanavitsky, refers to these as the 3 R's of robust strategies for improving the use of research evidence. And this is namely that stakeholders are more likely to engage with and use research evidence that is responsive. So it provides a good match to their needs, motivations, and circumstances. It's the research evidence they need, when they need it, and the format they need it, and takes into account how they plan to use it. It is routinized, meaning that it is integrated within existing individual and organizational routines, workflow, decision-making processes, and it is relational. It's focused on building or leveraging existing relationships with users. Also from the field of improving the use of research evidence, we have certain models that have been used that we know works. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about these types of research strategies that have been shown to improve the use of research evidence because they meet the 3 R's that Yanavitsky reminds us of. And I'd like to suggest some questions we might ask to improve the use of research evidence that is race and racism conscious, strengths-based, humanizing, co-constructed, and people and community centered. So research practice partnerships are a very now more, well, becoming an increasingly growing common way of bringing practitioners, such as could be in education or in social welfare or in other domains, bringing researchers together with community actors or practitioner actors, and helping to bring the research to bear on their decision making. So some possible questions are, can research practice partnerships function as a site to improve the capacity of school leaders to critique and use research evidence from an anti-racist lens? Another question might be, does involvement in the co-production of research grounded in an anti-racist stance help lead district decision makers to a deeper understanding of the racial biases that are currently built into the evidence base, how broadening the evidence base is beneficial to students and teachers, and whether they would consider anti-racist research more often in daily decisions and strategic planning. Another possibility might be, does the participation of child welfare, mental health, and probation department leaders and managers in anti-racist community development, RPP, increase their use of anti-racist research evidence and likelihood of anti-racist evidence-based practices? I'll note, as you can see, I've quoted my dear colleague and friend, Kim Dumont, and the wonderful Larry Palinkas, because what I did for generating these questions is look to what the foundation has already produced in terms of the research that we've funded and the things that we have already written and put out there, and said, what would happen if I took these ideas, these things that have already been done or have already been talked about, and said, what if we applied a critical race lens to it? How would it change that? What would it look like to do that? So here, another mechanism or another way that research has been used effectively is through the use of knowledge brokers. Knowledge brokers are people who serve as a bridge between researchers and research and people who would want to use that research, making it more accessible. So advocates can be knowledge brokers because they have their ear to the ground. So one question might be, can juvenile justice advocates with anti-racist and anti-sexist goals improve decision makers' use of research evidence that centers humanizing understandings of systems-involved Black girls? Another possibility is, do community-centered monitoring tools co-developed by civil rights advocates and critical race researchers improve child welfare agencies' use of evidence-based practices that meet the needs of marginalized communities? Also, participatory approaches are a very promising and have shown to be a very promising way of getting evidence used. So here we might ask, under what conditions do mental health administrators use strength-based anti-racist research generated through youth participatory action research? What gaps in the research evidence on police-involved violence against BIPOC youth does a collaborative team of youth, public defender, and researchers surface through a research synthesis? And under what decisions are policymakers likely to use research generated to fill the identified gaps? So these are just, these are just sort of teasers, right? Offerings, possibilities of questions that you might ask. But of course, under all of the different approaches, whether we're talking about knowledge brokers or RPPs or participatory approaches, it's really important to take into account questions of power and questions of, you know, who's at the table, right? So I'll here thank Lauren, here we go. Here we go, yeah. So our new senior program officer, Lauren Safley, I asked her to take a look at my slides, and she reminded me that it might be really useful for everyone here as we launch into our smaller groups to have this as something to start the conversation. So even as we design these studies, right? So integrating critical race perspectives into the actual design of improving URE studies, let alone the URE itself, right? Let alone the research itself, is really reflecting on what questions are being asked, who's at the table, what measures are being used, how are analyses and results conceptualized, and how are findings disseminated. And that is where I will stop.
Thank you so much, Fabienne. I know that for the participants who've been listening in, this is going to feel like an unsatisfying way to end the panel, because you have heard so many insightful and provocative ideas, and I know that there are lots of questions that you have. I hope, though, that what you've gotten is some stimulating thinking that you will take into your own work and to your further conversations with your colleagues. I can promise you that we at the Foundation see this as only the beginning of our own work and the conversations that we would like to convene with others. And so if this interests you, you can be assured that we will try to facilitate more further, deeper dialogue around these issues. I want to end by thanking our three terrific panelists. Really have pulled together an amazing set of presentations and leaving us with a lot of food for thought. For those grantees and special guests who will be joining us for the discussion groups, I'm going to give these discussion groups 5 minutes for a break, because our presenters certainly need a little break, and I bet some of you might need just a short break. You should have received Zoom links for getting onto the discussion group, so please refer to those. Thank you so much, everyone.